is difficult to imagine the world of Tudor England without the towering presence of King Henry VIII. His reign was filled with splendor, intrigue, political maneuvering, and grand displays of royal power. But behind the glittering court, behind the polished image of a monarch who commanded respect across Europe, there was another side of Henry's world, one that smelled of sweat, illness, and the less glamorous realities of human life. Nowhere was this more apparent than in the private chambers of the king himself, most especially, in the place where even kings could not escape their most basic needs. The royal bathroom, as one might call it, was not a room of porcelain basins and gleaming marble, but rather a carefully managed chamber where attendants known as the Grooms of the Stool held duties unlike any other in court. To clean up after Henry VIII was no ordinary task. It was a position that required trust, discretion, and, surprisingly, considerable influence. In Tudor England, the royal body was seen as sacred, the very vessel of divine kingship. And yet, like any man, Henry VIII was bound by the needs of nature. The responsibility of tending to those needs was entrusted to a handful of men who knew the king in a way that few others could ever claim. They were not simply servants. They were companions, advisors, and confidants. Still, the work they performed was a mixture of the intimate and the unpleasant, the noble and the foul. Imagine, for a moment, the chambers of Whitehall Palace in the early years of Henry's reign. The corridors smelled faintly of rushes scattered upon the floor, mingled with the smoke of torches and the faint odor of unwashed bodies. Sanitation was rudimentary, and though the palaces were splendid in appearance, they were far from hygienic by modern standards. The royal bathroom was a place tucked away near the king's private apartments, carefully concealed from the curious eyes of courtiers. Within its walls, Henry would take his ease, while those in his service performed their peculiar duty. The Groom of the Stool was not a role given lightly. It was often bestowed upon a man of noble birth, for the king would not trust such an intimate duty to a commoner. The stool itself, known in the court as the close stool, was a finely crafted wooden chair, often padded with velvet or leather, with a hinged lid and a removable chamber pot beneath. This was the throne behind the throne, the seat upon which the mighty monarch performed the most humble of acts. For Henry, the matter of his bowels was no trivial thing. His health was a subject of constant concern, for the king was plagued with digestive troubles and, later in life, ulcers and obesity that made even the simplest movements difficult. Thus, the Groom of the Stool was expected not only to clean, but to observe, to take note of the king's condition, and sometimes even to report on the state of his health. What was expelled from the king's body was studied with an almost medical seriousness, for it was believed to reveal much about his strength, his humors, and his ability to govern. But let us not be too quick to imagine this role as degrading. In truth, it was one of the most enviable positions at court. To be the man who attended Henry in such private moments was to have the king's ear quite literally at his most unguarded. While Henry sat upon his close stool, he would often speak candidly, free from the watchful eyes of counselors and rivals. The Groom of the Stool thus became privy to secrets, to confidences, and to decisions that might alter the course of the realm. The act of cleaning, then, was only one part of the duty. When Henry was finished, the chamber pot would be discreetly removed, its contents dealt with in a manner befitting royal waste. The exact methods varied. Sometimes the pot was emptied into cesspits within the palace grounds. Other times it was carried away to be disposed of more carefully. Fresh linens and water would be brought forth, for cleanliness, at least for the king, was considered essential. Soap was not always employed, for it was harsh and expensive. Instead, cloths of fine linen, warm water, and sometimes aromatic herbs were used. The attendants were careful, precise, and above all, deferential. One must understand, too, the atmosphere of ritual that surrounded even these acts. The Tudor court was a place where ceremony infused daily life, and even the process of relieving the king was imbued with dignity. The Groom of the Stool would bow, offer assistance if required, and ensure that the king's comfort was preserved at every moment. To falter in such duties would be unthinkable, for this was a task as serious as bearing the royal sword or the king's cup. Henry himself was not oblivious to the irony of it all. He was a man of sharp wit, and it is said that he sometimes made jokes at his own expense, recognizing that the majesty of kingship did not excuse him from the basest realities of life. Yet for those who served him, there was no laughter in the chamber. Their duty was one of gravity, bound by loyalty and the silent understanding that what happened behind those closed doors remained secret. Still, to imagine the world of Henry's bathroom is to step into a place of contrasts. Here was velvet drapery and perfumed cloth, set against the stench of human waste. Here was the grandeur of monarchy, pressed close against the unremarkable truth of mortality. And here, in the quiet moments of service, was a glimpse of Henry not as the larger-than-life figure of history, but as a man powerful, flawed, and very much human. In the years to come, the role of the Groom of the Stool would grow even more influential. Men who began their service by cleaning up after the king would rise to positions of immense power, their closeness to Henry translating into political clout. But for now, in the early chapters of Henry's reign, the task remained what it had always been, the strange, intimate labor of tending to the king's most private needs. Thus begins the story of what it was like to clean up after King Henry VIII. It is a tale not only of foul-smelling pots and weary attendants, but of trust, power, and the peculiar ways in which the body of a king could shape the destiny of a nation. The close stool, though humble in purpose, was anything but plain in design. In Henry VIII's court, even the object upon which he relieved himself was crafted with the finest materials of the day. It was often upholstered with velvet or leather, sometimes embroidered, sometimes adorned with brass fittings. The chamber pot beneath it was typically pewter, though on occasion silver might be used for ceremonial display after all. Even the king's waist was wrapped in a kind of majesty. To us, such attention to detail may seem absurd, but in the Tudor imagination, everything connected to the sovereign carried symbolic weight. The close stool was not a mere convenience. It was a piece of furniture worthy of the king's body. Its very presence affirmed the dignity of monarchy, even when that body performed acts that could not be made elegant. The man tasked with handling this stool, the groom of the stool, was therefore not mocked or pitied but respected, for his duty brought him into daily contact with the most private side of Henry's life. In an age when proximity to the king meant influence, the groom enjoyed an access that most noblemen envied. While others petitioned for audiences, the groom was already there, standing silently as Henry muttered his thoughts, weighed his strategies, or complained of his ailments. The king, prone to restlessness, often used the stool as a place of conversation. It was not unusual for him to summon documents, letters, or reports while seated there. Matters of state, the fates of men and nations, were sometimes decided while Henry remained half-hidden behind a curtain in his bathroom chamber. What might seem an indignity in another context became, in the Tudor court, another theater of power. For the attendants, however, this closeness was not without risk. The court of Henry VIII was a dangerous place where favor could turn to ruin in an instant. A groom who enjoyed the king's confidence might rise to wealth and power, but he also lived under the constant threat of suspicion. A careless word, an indiscreet comment, or the mere misfortune of being associated with a falling faction could spell disaster. To clean Henry's stool was to live at the edge of opportunity and peril, a life balanced as delicately as the chamber pot they carried. Yet, if we imagine the work itself, what did it truly entail? Each morning, the stool would be prepared with clean linens and scented herbs to mask odors. The Tudor world lacked the conveniences of modern plumbing, and so perfumes and botanicals lavender, rosemary, thyme were used to soften the air. The groom of the stool ensured everything was ready before Henry entered, for the king was known for his impatience. When his call came, there was no room for delay. When Henry had finished, the groom would step forward with cloths of fine linen dipped in warm water. Sometimes vinegar was added, believed to cleanse and prevent disease. The king's comfort was paramount, and every motion was performed with a ritualistic precision. Once cleaned, Henry would often wash his hands in a silver basin, a servant standing by with a towel of damask or Holland linen. The chamber pot itself was lifted carefully and carried away, always with discretion, for even in waste there was ceremony. Disposal was its own task. Palaces such as Whitehall were honeycombed with cesspits and drains. though they often overflowed and stank in summer heat. Night soil men, hired for the dirtiest labor, would empty them under cover of darkness, hauling the foul matter away to be used as fertilizer in fields beyond the city. But the waste of a king was not simply dumped without thought. It was managed, watched over, and guarded, for fear that some ill-wisher might use it for witchcraft or poisoning. Tudor superstition was rife with such anxieties, and the king's servants took no chances. The Groom of the Stool thus stood at the intersection of superstition, hygiene, and politics. He was custodian of the king's bodily functions, guardian of his secrets, and sometimes the first to sense when the monarch's health faltered, for Henry's digestion was never entirely sound. Rich banquets of roasted meats, spiced pies, and copious wine taxed his stomach, and later his growing obesity made movement painful. Constipation, indigestion, and even suspected fistulas troubled him. His waist, closely examined, often revealed signs of his decline. Imagine, then, the whispered concerns of attendants as they carried away a chamber pot heavier than usual, or noted the king's grimace as he sat upon the stool. What they saw was not simply filth, but portents of the realm's stability. For if the king were ill, the kingdom trembled. The groom, in his quiet vigilance, became an early herald of political storms. Still, there was routine in the work, and routine dulled the edge of disgust. To those who served, it became another part of life in the palace, no different from dressing the king in his hose or fastening his doublet. The Tudor court was steeped in ceremony from waking to sleeping, and the business of the stool was no exception. Bow, wait, cleanse, carry, dispose, all done with reverence, as though it were a sacred liturgy in the private chapel of the king's body. It is worth remembering that such tasks were not unique to Henry VIII. Kings before him and kings after all required attendance for these same needs. But in Henry's case, the stool became bound up with the larger story of his reign, for his grooms were men of consequence. Sir Henry Norris, Sir Anthony Denny, Sir Thomas Heneage, names that echo in Tudor records, were all grooms of the stool, wielding influence far beyond their humble-sounding office. They were consulted in matters of marriage, war, and succession. They held the king's trust not only in private but in public. And all of it began with the daily ritual of the bathroom. This strange mingling of the intimate and the political shaped the court in ways both visible and invisible. The groom of the stool was gatekeeper to the king's person, controlling access at moments when the king was most unguarded. To be admitted into that chamber was to step into the very heart of royal confidence. Few men in history can claim such closeness, and fewer still could hold it without falling into ruin. The chamber itself, though hidden, bore marks of its royal occupant. Tapestries might hang upon the walls, muffling sound. A brazier in winter provided warmth, its smoke mingling with the scents of herbs. In summer, the windows stood open, letting in the smell of the Thames, rank with refuse and rot. Here, amid these contrasts, the daily work of tending Henry unfolded, half courtly ritual, half menial labor. One can imagine the hush that surrounded the chamber, the quiet footfalls of attendants, the rustle of velvet, the muffled cough of a servant waiting beyond the curtain. In that hush, power moved silently as decisions were whispered and orders given, and when the king rose from his stool, adjusting his robes, the world resumed its course as though nothing unusual had taken place. Yet everything that happened there mattered, for the bathroom of Henry VIII was not just a place of relief, it was a chamber of power, of secrecy, and of human frailty. And in the hands of those who served him, the act of cleaning became something far larger, a service to the throne itself, performed daily, silently, and with unshakable loyalty. If one wishes to understand the strangeness of the groom of the stool's position, one must first grasp how the Tudor court functioned. The court was not merely a place where officials gathered. It was a world unto itself, governed by hierarchy, ritual, and spectacle. Every action of the king was both personal and political. His meals, his clothing, his movements, even his sleep, were carefully staged and witnessed by attendants. Nothing about him was trivial, because he embodied the state itself. In this setting, Henry VIII's bathroom duties became a curious theater of intimacy and influence. The groom of the stool was not just a servant wiping away what the king left behind. He was a man entrusted with access to the very core of royal life, and in Tudor England, access was power. To see Henry at his most vulnerable was to gain a kind of leverage. The groom witnessed him not in grand processions or glittering banquets, but in his private chamber, half-undressed, weary, and human. It was in these moments that Henry spoke most freely, and those who stood beside him had the rare privilege of hearing words unscripted, unguarded. Let us step closer into this chamber. Imagine the heavy curtain drawn across the doorway, shutting out the restless noise of courtiers and petitioners. Inside, the air is warm with the faint scent of herbs scattered to mask less pleasant odors. A chair padded with velvet awaits, the close stool polished and ready, its pewter pot fitted neatly beneath the hinged lid. Linen cloths lie folded nearby, a basin of water stands prepared, and the groom himself waits in silence. Every movement rehearsed, every gesture performed with quiet respect. Henry enters. His frame, already in his 30s, thickening with indulgence, carries the weight of a king who revels in hunting, feasting, and jousting. He lowers himself, robes adjusted by another attendant, and the business of relief begins. There is no embarrassment, no shame, such things have no place here. The groom stands at hand, waiting not only to clean, but to listen. For Henry, like many monarchs, used this time as an opportunity to converse. What did the king say in those moments? History leaves no transcripts of stool-side conversations, but we can imagine the tone. He might speak of alliances, of France or Spain, of marriage negotiations with Catherine of Aragon. He might grumble about Wolsey, his cardinal and minister, or boast of a recent hunt. He might, even in jest, comment on the irony of power that the ruler of England must still sit upon a stool like any other man. The groom, trained in discretion, never repeated these words. His loyalty was absolute, for betrayal would mean not only disgrace but death. And so the chamber became a sanctuary, a place where the king's thoughts could spill out unfiltered, where he could think aloud without the burden of ceremony. After the act was done, the ritual of cleaning began. The groom stepped forward, offering warm water and cloth. He moved carefully, for Henry could be short-tempered when uncomfortable. The chamber pot was lifted, carried through the quiet corridors, and emptied into the cesspits of Whitehall. And though the work was menial, it was never treated lightly, for the groom's influence extended far beyond the stool. Letters to the king often passed first through his hands. Requests for royal favor were whispered to him, in hopes he might mention them at the right moment. His advice, given casually while the king sat in privacy, might sway decisions that determined the fates of nobles and commoners alike. It is no exaggeration to say that England's politics, at times, flowed through the same chamber where Henry relieved himself. This peculiar mingling of filth and power shaped the lives of those who held the office. Sir Henry Norris, one of Henry's grooms of the stool, became a trusted companion and was often seen at the king's side. He enjoyed wealth and honor, but in 1536 he fell under suspicion, accused falsely. Most believe of adultery with Anne Boleyn, Henry's second queen. Despite years of service, Norris was sent to the scaffold. The intimacy that once gave him influence also left him exposed to sudden ruin. Thus, the groom lived always in a paradox. His role was at once the lowest and the highest, bound up with filth yet intertwined with majesty. He could be a confidant of kings, yet at any moment the tide of fortune might sweep him away. The stool itself, meanwhile, remained a constant presence in Henry's life. At home in palaces, it followed him even on progresses, those grand journeys the king made through his realm to impress subjects and assert authority. Wherever Henry traveled, the close stool traveled with him, packed carefully among the baggage, carried by servants, and set up in his lodgings. No feast, no battle, no negotiation was too grand to prevent the king's need for privacy. And wherever that need arose, the groom was there, ready to perform his duty. Such duties, repeated daily, created a bond unlike any other. Few men could claim to know Henry VIII so well, to see him stripped of all pretense, to stand near him in his most natural and unguarded moments. This bond gave the groom a rare intimacy, but also a burden. He was the keeper of secrets, the silent witness to a monarch's frailties. He could not boast of what he saw nor share what he heard. His service was bound by silence as much as by ritual. And yet, perhaps there was a kind of comfort for Henry in this. Surrounded by courtiers who schemed and ministers who maneuvered, he knew that his groom of the stool served without ambition in that chamber. Whatever words he spoke, they were heard only by one man, and that man's loyalty was absolute. In a reign marked by betrayal and suspicion, such constancy was no small gift. Still, we must not romanticize the work. The odors were real, the waste heavy, the labor unceasing. Summer heat thickened the stench of cesspits, and winter chills made water for cleansing almost unbearable to the touch. The groom endured it all, for duty to the king left no room for complaint. Theirs was a service at once humiliating and exalted, humble in action but great in consequence. So, what was it like to clean up Henry VIII's bathroom? It was to live in a world of contradictions. To bow before a king while holding his chamber pot. To stand in velvet-hung chambers and yet deal daily with filth. To wield influence at the very heart of power and yet remain invisible, one of history's quietest figures. It was to live in closeness with majesty and to discover that even kings are, in the end, only men. This paradox was not lost on those who lived through it. They knew that behind every glittering pageant of Tudor power lay the quiet, hidden labor of men like the groom of the stool. They knew that history-esque grand events were whispered into being in rooms that smelled faintly of herbs, smoke, and something less pleasant. And they knew that to clean the king's bathroom was, in its strange way, to help shape the destiny of England. The Tudor world was one of dazzling contradictions. On the one hand, the court sparkled with the brilliance of gold-threaded tapestries, gleaming suits of armor, and feasts where the table sagged under roasted boar and swan. On the other hand, it was a world where sanitation remained crude, where sickness lurked in the very walls of the palaces, and where odors seeped through the grandest chambers. To clean Henry VIII's bathroom was to stand precisely at the intersection of these two realities, the glittering majesty of kingship and the unavoidable truth of human frailty. Henry himself was a monarch obsessed with image. He cultivated an aura of power, majesty, and virility. His portraits, broad-shouldered, commanding, dressed in fur and jewels, were designed to strike awe. But what those paintings never revealed was the hidden chamber, tucked behind velvet curtains, where Henry would sit upon his close stool. There, his body revealed what no artist would ever paint, the struggles of digestion, the pains of ulcers, the slow toll of a body that bore both wealth and illness. The groom of the stool, standing silently beside him, bore witness to that reality. And in so doing, he occupied a strange role in the king's life, both servant and confidant, both custodian of filth and guardian of the king's dignity. His work ensured that Henry's private life remained concealed from the court at large, his frailties hidden, his humanity preserved behind closed doors. This was no small matter. In an age when kings ruled by divine right, the monarch's body was more than flesh and blood. It was a symbol of authority, a vessel of God's will on earth. Any sign of weakness in the king could be read as a weakness in the realm itself. To admit that Henry struggled with his bowels, that he suffered from constipation or bleeding, would be to admit that the king was vulnerable. The groom's labor, humble though it seemed, was part of preserving the illusion of royal perfection. And so the chamber was carefully prepared each day. Fresh rushes were laid on the floor, sometimes scented with lavender or herbs to sweeten the air. The stool itself was polished, its velvet cushion brushed clean. A basin of warm water was set ready, towels of fine linen folded neatly. The groom's tools were simple but chosen with care: linen cloths, basins, ewers of water, and at times vinegar or rosewater for cleansing. Everything had its place, for the king would brook no disorder. Henry's temper was notorious, and those who served him knew the danger of even the smallest mistake. A groom who fumbled with the chamber pot, who delayed too long, or who allowed an unpleasant odor to linger risked the king's wrath. Yet to displease Henry was no trivial matter. His anger could mean dismissal, disgrace, or worse. In such an atmosphere, even the simple act of cleaning became a delicate performance, every gesture measured, every action weighed with caution. But danger was not the only aspect of the groom's life. There was privilege, too. He enjoyed daily, uninterrupted access to the king. While ministers like Wolsey or Cromwell schemed for influence, The groom simply stood where no one else could stand and listened. Henry might ask his opinion on a hunting ground, on the loyalty of a courtier, or even on the charms of a lady at court. The groom's words, spoken in such a moment, carried more weight than the polished speeches of noblemen. In this way, the bathroom chamber became a curious arena of politics. Decisions of marriage, of alliances, of executions even, might have begun in idle conversation as Henry relieved himself. History records the outcomes treaties signed, queens divorced, men sent to the block, but the beginnings of those decisions may well have echoed first within the narrow, curtained chamber of the close stool. Beyond politics, however, there was the simple matter of Henry's health, which was never far from his mind. In his youth, he had been athletic and vigorous, famed for his jousting and dancing. But as the years passed, his body changed. Injuries, particularly a wound to his leg, grew infected and never fully healed. His appetite, unchecked, led to obesity. His stomach troubled him constantly. The groom of the stool, in attending him daily, was among the first to see the decline. The heaviness of his step, the groan as he sat, the changes in what the chamber pot revealed, these were signs that the king was no longer the man he once had been. And yet, Henry demanded that the illusion of vigor be maintained. In public, he appeared splendid, cloaked in fur and jewels, his massive frame an emblem of strength. In private, he leaned heavily on his attendants, relying on them to help him perform the simplest tasks. To clean his stool, then, was not merely to clear away filth, it was to uphold the image of kingship itself. For the groom, this required not only obedience, but also absolute silence. To speak of what he saw would have been unthinkable. The secrets of Henry's body, like the secrets of his council, were guarded with utmost care. Indeed, one might say the groom was a kind of physician, a watcher of the royal body, though without the formal training. He observed, reported discreetly if needed, and always acted to shield the king from shame. Outside the chamber, the groom lived as a man of privilege. His position brought him wealth, fine clothing, and a place of honor in the royal household. He dined well, he was courted by those seeking influence, and he enjoyed the confidence of the most powerful man in England. Yet he lived, too, with a constant shadow, the knowledge that favor could vanish in an instant. Many who rose high under Henry fell swiftly, their heads rolling on Tower Hill. The groom of the stool, though privileged, walked always on dangerous ground. Still, the role endured because it was necessary. For all his majesty, Henry VIII could not escape the needs of his body. He could not feast without digestion, could not drink without consequence, could not live without the daily rhythms of nature. And each time those rhythms asserted themselves, the groom was there, patient, silent, efficient. The paradox remained striking. A man whose hands bore the king's chamber pot could shape the politics of an empire. A servant of filth could, in another sense, be master of influence. The groom of the stool embodied the strangeness of Tudor power, where intimacy and authority intertwined in ways that defy modern understanding. Thus, the story of Henriette's bathroom is not merely one of odor and chamber pots, it is a story of trust, of secrecy, of the peculiar ways in which human frailty and royal majesty met behind a velvet curtain. And it is a reminder, too, that history, for all its grandeur, is always grounded in the realities of flesh and blood. Even a king, for all his splendor, must sit upon a stool. And even a kingdom, for all its glory, depends upon the quiet, unseen labors of those who clean it. In the heart of Tudor palaces at Whitehall, Hampton Court, Greenwich, or Windsor, there were chambers glittering with opulence. Banqueting halls soared with painted ceilings, music drifted through galleries, and courtiers paraded in brocades and silks. Yet tucked behind these spaces of magnificence lay the private rooms of Henry VIII, where the business of kingship gave way to the business of nature. The groom of the stool, the man who held perhaps the strangest office in English history, lived his life between these two worlds. To courtiers he was a man of privilege, dining at the king's table, consulted for favors, whispered to by those who longed for the king's ear. Yet to Henry himself, the groom was above all a servant of intimacy, the one man permitted to tend to his most private needs. The stool itself deserves closer attention. To call it a toilet would be misleading. The Tudor close stool was as much a piece of furniture as a bed or a chair, carved from oak or walnut, cushioned with velvet or leather, and sometimes adorned with embroidery. It was a mark of status as much as a tool of necessity. Indeed, nobles too possessed their own close stools, often portable, carried with them when traveling. But none were so finely wrought as that of the king. The chamber pot beneath was removable, crafted of pewter, ceramic, or, for the monarch, even silver. After use, it was carefully taken up, covered with a cloth, and carried discreetly through the palace to be emptied. The very act of carrying it was steeped in ritual discretion, for the contents were considered not merely foul but potentially dangerous. In an age rife with superstition, royal waste could be used for ill purposes, witchcraft, poisoning, or curses. Thus, its disposal was no trivial matter. The groom himself was not expected to haul the pot to the cesspits. That work was left to lesser servants, but he oversaw the process, ensuring it was done properly with dignity and secrecy. His own role was more refined: to stand by, to offer assistance, to clean, and above all, to maintain the king's comfort. To modern eyes, this may seem degrading. Yet in the Tudor court, it was considered one of the highest honors a man could hold. Why? Because it meant proximity. The groom of the stool was always near the king, always in his private chambers, always within earshot of his unguarded words. Influence in Henry's court was not gained by titles alone, but by nearness. And no one was nearer than the groom. It is perhaps for this reason that the office was reserved for men of noble birth. A king could not risk such intimacy with a commoner. He required men whose loyalty was bound not only by duty but by blood, kinship, and honor. The grooms were thus drawn from among gentlemen of rank, men who already belonged to the circles of privilege. In this way, what might seem a humiliating duty was transformed into a post of prestige. Consider, for example, Sir Henry Norris, one of the most famous grooms of the stool. For years he was a trusted companion of Henry, so close that he was often described as the king's shadow. He attended hunts, tournaments, and councils, yet his influence sprang from his role in the private chamber. Courtiers petitioned him for favors, knowing he could whisper a request to Henry at just the right moment. His closeness, however, became his undoing, for when Anne Boleyn fell from grace, Norris was swept away with her, accused of treason and executed. His fate demonstrates the peril that lurked within the honor of the stool. To be close to Henry was to stand always on dangerous ground. But before such peril there was routine, and in routine there was monotony. Imagine the daily rhythm of the groom. He rose early, long before Henry, to ensure that the chamber was clean and ready. Rushes were strewn upon the floor, scented herbs scattered to mask odor. The stool was checked, the basin filled, the linens prepared. All must be perfect, for the king would not tolerate disorder. When Henry summoned him, the groom stepped into silence. He bowed, waited, and attended. Sometimes the king spoke, sometimes he remained silent, brooding upon matters of state. Sometimes he joked, for Henry had a sharp humor, and no part of life was exempt from it, not even the bathroom. But the groom never laughed unless permitted. His role was to reflect Henry's mood, to be present without intrusion. Once the act was finished, the groom carried out the ritual of cleansing. Warm water, linen cloths, perhaps rose water to refresh. He worked swiftly, discreetly, never allowing the king to feel discomfort. The chamber pot was lifted away, its contents managed with caution. Then the groom washed his own hands, using vinegar or herbs, and prepared the chamber for the next use. It was simple work, yet performed with a formality that gave it dignity. The irony of this position cannot be overstated. To the world, Henry was a figure of almost divine authority, God's anointed ruler. Yet here he was, dependent on another man to wipe him clean. It is a truth that strips away illusion, reminding us that beneath the velvet robes and jeweled crowns, kings remain men of flesh and need. The groom of the stool, more than anyone else, knew this truth, and yet perhaps it was precisely this intimacy that gave the groom his extraordinary influence. For Henry trusted those who shared his private life more than those who served him in public. He knew the groom had no choice but to remain silent, bound by both loyalty and the unspoken bond of shared vulnerability. In a court seething with ambition and treachery, that trust was invaluable. The world beyond the stool was filled with grandeur. Trumpets announced the king's arrivals. Courtiers bowed low. Ambassadors brought gifts from foreign lands. Yet none of these glittering figures stood where the groom stood. None saw what he saw. None heard the king's voice in the quiet chamber behind the curtain. It was a strange form of power, hidden, silent, and easily overlooked by historians, but it shaped the court as surely as any minister or general. Thus, to clean Henry VIII's bathroom was not merely to sweep away filth. It was to hold in one's hands the paradox of monarchy itself, the blending of majesty and mortality, splendor and stench, crown and chamber pot. It was to stand daily at the border between the king's image and his reality, and to guard that border with unwavering loyalty. And so, as we continue to peer into this hidden chamber, we see not only the oddity of the task, but the deeper truth it reveals, that the greatness of kings is always balanced upon the small, unseen labors of those who serve them. Each morning in the great palaces of King Henry VIII, before the king himself had even risen from his bed, a quiet but essential duty awaited one of the most curious roles at court, the groom of the stool. This figure, often a nobleman of some rank, was charged with attending to the most personal of royal necessities, the care of the king's chamber pot. The task was deceptively simple on the surface: to empty, clean, and return the vessel upon which the most powerful man in England had relieved himself. Yet surrounding this daily duty was a ritual so layered in hierarchy, symbolism, and formality that it became far more than just an act of sanitation. It was, in its own strange way, a cornerstone of Henry's domestic monarchy. The chamber pot itself was no ordinary container. Crafted often of silver, pewter, or fine earthenware, it was lined to preserve dignity and designed to signal refinement, even in matters where refinement seemed least possible. Some were adorned with subtle engravings, the royal arms, or decorative flourishes, for even the basest functions of Henry's body could not escape the trappings of wealth. A king could not, after all, be seen as ordinary even in the latrine. When the groom of the stool approached, he did so with the gravity of a man attending a sacred relic. Dressed neatly, sometimes in garments gifted to him directly by the king, he would remove the pot from its discreet wooden chair known as a close stool, which was cushioned and draped in fine cloth so that Henry could sit comfortably during his private moments. The stool was not hidden away in some distant privy. It was kept near the king's chamber, a reflection of how monarchs were always within reach of their attendants, never truly alone. Once the groom lifted the vessel, he would carry it carefully to an adjoining room set aside for the purpose. The pot was never hurriedly sloshed about like some servant might treat a common bucket. No, this was a royal object, filled with royal matter, and it had to be handled with care. The air within the palace corridors might already have carried a mingling of sense food being prepared, rushes on the floor being walked upon, fires burning in hearths, but the contents of the king's chamber pot were unmistakable. To mask these odors, herbs were often kept close at hand. Sprigs of lavender, rosemary, or sweet marjoram might be scattered nearby or tucked into cloth. The groom might even wave a perfumed handkerchief discreetly before his face, though never in a way that suggested distaste for the king's bodily functions. To show disgust would have been an insult to Henry himself. After all, this was the waste of the monarch chosen by God to rule England. The act of disposal took on its own formality. In some cases, the contents would be carried to a designated pit or sluice within the palace grounds, where waste from the household collected. In other cases, depending on the location, it might be poured into running water or buried beneath earth. What seems to us a purely practical matter was, to the Tudors, a procedure tinged with ritual significance. It reflected not just hygiene, but order, discipline, and the maintenance of a king's dignity. When the pot was finally rinsed, it was often washed with vinegar or scented waters to cleanse it and to leave behind a faint fragrance, a gesture of refinement for the next use. Some attendants took pride in ensuring the vessel gleamed, for it reflected upon their diligence and indirectly upon the respect owed to their position. Strange as it may seem, there was honor bound up in this task. The groom of the stool was not simply a cleaner, he was a confidant. privy, in the truest sense of the word, to the most private moments of Henry's life. Through this daily ritual, the groom gained extraordinary intimacy with the king, often discussing matters of state while performing his duties. Henry, perhaps more comfortable during these natural moments, would sometimes speak candidly, making the groom of the Stool one of the few individuals who heard his unguarded thoughts. To clean Henry's chamber pot was not just a matter of hygiene, it was a gateway to influence. Thus, the quiet act of emptying and cleansing the royal vessel became a symbol of how intertwined the body and the crown were in Tudor England. A monarch might project divine majesty, but he was still flesh, still bound to the same needs as any man. And yet, those needs, when performed by Henry, became elevated into rituals that reminded all present that even the ordinary was extraordinary when it concerned the king. One might imagine the groom carrying away the vessel in the early light of morning, the corridors hushed, the weight in his hands not just of silver and porcelain, but of duty, secrecy, and unspoken power. The sound of water pouring, the faint scent of herbs, the gleam of a polished rimall of these details marked a routine that was at once humble and grand, banal and significant. It is in these quiet acts, often hidden from history's spotlight, that the peculiar drama of Henry's court reveals itself. For in the chamber pot of a king lay not only waste, but also the strange paradox of monarchy, that divine right and human frailty were forever inseparable. If there was one duty that lingered longer than most, it was the endless task of washing and refreshing the king's linens. Unlike the chamber pots, which at least had the reward of being emptied once and then forgotten for a time, linens were a perpetual cycle. Stripped, sorted, scrubbed, soaked, dried, folded, carried, and then set out again, day after day, week after week. It was a job that could not be hurried, for the king's comfort demanded perfection, and perfection was slow. The process began with the collection. A servant, careful not to wrinkle their nose too obviously, would remove the soiled sheets and towels from the chamber. These were not the coarse fabrics used by commoners, but fine materials linen of a tight weave, smooth under the fingers, sometimes embroidered or edged in delicate lace. And yet, no matter how fine the cloth, the truth of its purpose could not be ignored. It absorbed sweat, waste, and odors as any fabric would, and thus it needed constant attention. The linens would be gathered in baskets woven from willow and carried to the laundry, which was not near the royal chambers, but in an outbuilding where the heat of boiling tubs and the smell of lye soap would not disturb the court. The laundresses, often older women with red, raw hands and backs bent from years of labor, would greet the piles not with horror but with routine resignation. For them, a stained royal sheet was no more troublesome than a peasant's tunic. It was all fabric, and fabric demanded care. The first step was soaking. Large wooden tubs would be filled with hot water into which the linens were lowered. Ashlye, a kind of early soap, would be stirred in with long paddles, creating a froth that clung to the surface. The fabric would sit in this mixture for hours, allowing stains to loosen, and the laundresses would prod at the cloth with wooden rods, turning and pushing it so that the lye seeped into every fold. The smell was acrid, sharp enough to sting the eyes, but it was accepted as the price of cleanliness. Next came the scrubbing. Each piece of linen would be lifted out of the soaking tub and carried to a sloped board, roughened for grip. With coarse brushes, the laundresses would scrub at marks left by sweat, oil, or worse. The sound was rhythmic bristle against cloth, water dripping back into the tub, the soft grunt of effort. Over and over again the motion repeated, so steady that it became almost hypnotic, a pattern that dulled thought into monotony. After scrubbing, the rinsing began. The sheets were lowered into fresh tubs of clean water, or in some cases, taken to running streams near the palace where they could be swirled and pounded against stones. The water carried away the soap, leaving the cloth cleaner but heavier. It clung to the hands as it was lifted, sagging with weight, dripping streams onto the floor. The laundresses worked in teams, 2 or 3 to a sheet, lifting, twisting, wringing, the fabric groaning under the strain. Once wrung, the linens needed to dry. In summer, they could be carried outside and spread across wooden frames or ropes, fluttering faintly in the breeze. In winter, however, drying was more difficult, and the laundry would hang indoors near the fires, where the smell of damp cloth mingled with the smoke. Days could pass before the fabric was truly dry, and until then, the air was heavy with the scent of wet linen. But the work did not end with drying. The king's linens needed pressing and folding, for no wrinkle was acceptable. Flat irons, heated in the fire, would be pressed against the cloth, their weight smoothing every crease. It was slow, deliberate work, for the iron cooled quickly and had to be reheated again and again. The laundresses moved in silence, lifting, pressing, their motions as repetitive as the beating of a drum. At last, when the linens were clean, dry, and pressed, they were carried back to the palace and stacked neatly in chests or on shelves. Servants would draw from these piles when the king required fresh sheets or towels, unfolding them with care so that no wrinkle showed. They would be laid upon the bed, smooth and cool, or draped over rails in the bathing chamber, waiting for use. And then the cycle would begin again. Within days, the sheets would be soiled, the towels damp with use, and the whole process would start once more: collection, soaking, scrubbing, rinsing, wringing, drying, pressing, folding, replacing. There was no end to it, only the repetition of duty, the slow turning of a wheel that never stopped. The servants and laundresses rarely spoke of this work with drama, for to them it was nothing but routine. Yet, in its own way, it was as vital to the smooth running of the court as any political intrigue or royal decree. For what was a king without his comfort? What was majesty without the illusion of purity and order? The laundresses, with their raw hands and tired eyes, maintained that illusion day after day, one linen at a time. And as they worked, they created a rhythm of history so dull, so steady, that it lulled thought into a kind of sleep. The endless washing of cloth became not a story of action, but of stillness, water dripping, brushes scrubbing, irons pressing, the cycle repeating, as monotonous and ceaseless as time itself. Once the chamber pot had been emptied, the linens cleaned, and the fresh towels laid out. Another layer of preparation began, one that combined ritual, hygiene, and subtle displays of wealth. This task fell again to the groom of the stool and a select team of attendants who understood that the king's private chambers were more than mere rooms. They were extensions of his authority, spaces where even the mundane demanded ceremony. The chamber itself had to be spotless. Every surface, from the polished oak floors to the carved wooden panels on the walls, received attention. Dust was brushed, wax was applied, and even the faint smell of smoke from nearby hearths was tempered with the scent of herbs and flowers. Rosemary, lavender, and sometimes rose petals were scattered across rushes laid upon the floor. These herbs were not only for fragrance, they were believed to purify the air, to protect against disease, and, perhaps, to soften the inevitable odors that arose when royalty relieved themselves. Attention was also given to the furniture. The stool, though primarily functional, was polished and adjusted for the king's comfort. The velvet or leather cushions were plumped and straightened, every fold in the cloth corrected. The groom of the stool moved with practiced care, aware that even the smallest imperfection could draw Henry's ire. And yet the work required patience. The king would sometimes linger in his chamber, delaying his own business, or engage in conversation with his attendant, testing the groom's discretion, listening to his counsel, or simply asserting his presence. Mirrors, though rudimentary compared to modern glass, were also cleaned. They reflected not just the king's appearance, but the image of his domain. If a mirror was smudged, if a sheen of dust settled upon the polished wood, it would diminish the sense of order and grandeur that Henry demanded. The groom, in polishing the glass and the surrounding wood, was preserving more than hygiene. He was preserving the very perception of the king's majesty. Candlesticks and sconces were wiped and positioned to cast light, just so, ensuring that the chamber appeared illuminated in a way that flattered the king while revealing nothing unseemly. Wax was checked and trimmed, flames were aligned, and the soft glow would later allow Henry to read, to confer with trusted advisors, or simply to enjoy a quiet moment of solitude. Every candle, every flicker of light, contributed to the ritual of preparation, a ceremony that made the chamber both functional and sacred. Even the basin of water used for washing was scrubbed and arranged with meticulous precision. Linen cloths were folded and placed strategically, while small ewers of fresh water were set on low tables or stands. The groom ensured the temperature of the water was suitable, knowing the king's comfort was paramount. Too cold and Henry might complain, too hot and the delicate linens could be damaged. This required not only skill but careful observation and timing. Throughout this slow, deliberate work, the groom remained silent unless spoken to. He understood that his presence was meant to be invisible, that the chamber's perfection depended on his unobtrusive diligence. Any sign of impatience, of frustration, or of disgust at the odors and tasks at hand would have been deemed unacceptable. This combination of service, restraint, and attention to detail is what elevated the groom's position beyond that of a mere servant, granting him access to the king's trust and confidence. The process was repeated endlessly. Each morning, each evening, every use of the chamber required the same careful attention, the same rituals of cleanliness, polishing, and preparation. There was a rhythm to it, a quiet monotony that defined the daily life of those who served closest to the king. And within this monotony lay a strange kind of power, the ability to control the environment of the monarch, to shape his experience of comfort, and to stand perpetually near him in moments of intimacy that no one else could share. The groom of the stool, in overseeing this ritual, existed at the intersection of filth and majesty. His hands moved over objects that carried the evidence of human waste and the sheen of royal grandeur, and in doing so, he embodied the strange paradox of Tudor life, that authority and vulnerability, dignity and degradation could coexist in a single room. Every polished surface, every scented herb, every meticulously arranged cloth contributed not only to hygiene but to the illusion of perfection, a perfection that the king's attendants ensured even in moments that history rarely records. Thus, polishing and preparing Henry VIII's chamber was not a task to be hurried. It required hours of steady work, careful attention, and unwavering patience. For the groom and his assistants, it was a slow, almost hypnotic labor, the repetition of which became a defining rhythm of life at court, rhythm punctuated by the demands of the king, the odor of the chamber, the gleam of silver, and the soft rustle of linen. In that slow repetition, the bizarre dignity of the groom's position became clear. He was both servant and custodian of majesty, standing at the threshold of human frailty and royal authority. While outsiders imagined the life of King Henry VIII's court as one of endless feasts, tournaments, and intrigue, the reality for the groom of the stool was far different. Much of his power and influence rested not in public spectacles but in quiet, unglamorous vigilance. He lived in a world of repetition, of rituals repeated morning and evening, each one intended to maintain the illusion of perfection around a man who, despite his wealth and authority, remained remarkably human. The groom's day began well before sunrise. In the dim light of the palace, he would move silently through corridors that were still hushed with sleep, carrying basins, cloths, and herbs in preparation for the king's private rituals. The corridors themselves held a peculiar mix of grandeur and mundane reality. Tapestries lined the walls, reflecting wealth and taste, while the floor beneath bore the marks of servants, nobles, and horses that had traversed them the night before. The groom, aware of every detail, stepped lightly, mindful that even the smallest disturbance could wake the king prematurely. Upon reaching the chamber, the groom would survey the room with meticulous care. The close stool was checked once more, cushions adjusted, rushes inspected for wear or debris, and herbs scattered to maintain a subtle fragrance. Even the placement of the basin and water ewers was considered, for Henry preferred precision in all things, and small slights to his comfort could provoke his temper. This was a lesson learned over countless mornings, that service to the king demanded patience, discretion, and attentiveness beyond what most could imagine. Once Henry entered the chamber, the groom's role shifted from preparation to vigilant attendance. Though he stood quietly, his senses were fully engaged. He noticed every change in the king's demeanor, a slight frown, a shift in weight, the tone of a cough or groan. Each observation was a form of intelligence gathering. The king's physical comfort and emotional state were inseparable from the administration of his kingdom. The groom's knowledge of these private details gave him influence rarely shared by ministers or courtiers. During these intimate moments, the groom also managed the delicate choreography of hygiene. He offered water for washing hands, ensured towels were within reach, and monitored the chamber pot itself. Each action required subtlety. Too slow, and the king's patience might fray. Too hasty, and he risked spilling or mishandling the vessel, an offense that could bring anger or even disgrace. The groom's mastery lay in balancing efficiency with discretion, performing duties that were invisible in their perfection, yet essential to the daily life of a monarch. The chamber was not merely functional, it was a theater of controlled sensory experience. Fragrant herbs masked odors, polished wood reflected light to enhance the sense of order, and the faint sounds of water or rustling cloth became part of a ritual that reinforced the king's dignity. The groom, fully aware of this, approached each task as both a servant and a silent steward of royal majesty. His hands touched objects imbued with both utility and symbolism, and his attentiveness ensured that the king's privacy remained unviolated. It is important to note that this role was far from static. The groom had to be responsive, adapting to the king's whims and needs. Henry could linger, converse, or issue commands while attending to his personal matters, and the groom had to respond instantly, providing assistance without hesitation or visible effort. The capacity to anticipate the king's needs, to maintain decorum while performing repetitive and unglamorous tasks, was what separated an ordinary servant from the groom of the stool. Through this daily vigilance, the groom's position became one of paradoxical power. Though he labored amidst what might seem the most mundane and unworthy duties, emptying chamber pots, polishing stools, scattering herbs, he was constantly in proximity to authority itself. He observed the king in moments of vulnerability that no one else could witness, and in doing so, he gained a form of influence unique in the Tudor court. His silence, his attentiveness, and his discretion were both his shield and his currency. Outside the chamber, courtiers and ministers could only speculate about the king's moods, his opinions, or the secrets he might reveal. The groom, however, had a front-row seat to the subtleties of royal temperament. He knew when the king was troubled, when he was pleased, or when he contemplated matters of great consequence. And while the chamber's rituals were repetitive, the knowledge gained there was invaluable, quietly shaping the king's decisions and, by extension, the course of the kingdom. The groom's work, though monotonous, carried a rhythm that both grounded and mesmerized those who performed it. Day after day, year after year, the cycle repeated: preparation, attendance, cleansing, polishing, and monitoring. In its repetitive nature, the labor was meditative, almost hypnotic, a slow pulse that marked life at the very center of royal authority. In these moments of quiet service, the groom became more than a mere servant. He was a witness to history, a custodian of dignity, and an invisible hand guiding the comfort of a king whose power was absolute yet inseparably human. In the grand tapestry of Henry VIII's court, power was often measured not by titles or battlefields, but by proximity, by who could stand closest to the king in moments unseen. And none stood closer than the groom of the stool. While nobles and ministers petitioned in grand halls, sending letters or making speeches, the groom wielded influence quietly, invisibly, by simply being present during the most private aspects of Henry's life. The groom's daily routine placed him in a constant position of observation. He noted the king's habits, his moods, his whispered thoughts. Henry, a man of immense temper and sharp intelligence, was known to test those around him subtly, observing their reactions even in trivial circumstances, and who was always at hand, observing without appearing to do so. The groom, in this strange intersection of service and surveillance, he became both confidant and silent counselor, though rarely consulted openly. The chamber, as monotonous as it may have seemed, was a theater in which this influence was enacted. Each morning, the groom oversaw the preparation of the stool, the linens, the water, and the scattered herbs. Each detail mattered: the softness of the cushions, the temperature of the water, the exact placement of scented rushes. A misstep could irritate the king, or worse, suggest a lack of loyalty. In contrast, perfection in these small tasks drew quiet recognition, creating a subtle bond of trust that extended beyond the chamber itself. Henry's trust in the groom also meant that secrets were shared, or at least glimpsed. Matters of state, the king's personal reflections, his fears about succession or foreign alliances, all became more transparent in the presence of one who saw him unguarded. While courtiers competed for favor in noisy, conspicuous ways, the groom's influence was silent, patient, and persistent. He learned to read nuances, a frown, a sigh, a change in posture, and he could predict mood or intent. This ability, though unspoken, often shaped decisions indirectly, marking the groom as an unacknowledged yet essential participant in the court's political life. This proximity to power carried risk as well as reward. The king could be generous, rewarding diligence with lands, titles, or influence. Yet Henry's temper was legendary, and a moment's displeasure could ruin even the most trusted servant. The groom had to navigate a delicate balance, attentive but unobtrusive, loyal but discreet. Mistakes in the smallest tasks, spilling water, misplacing linens, failing to notice a detail could threaten not only reputation but livelihood. In essence, every action in the chamber was a test of character, patience, and endurance. Even the most mundane aspects of the role reinforced this intricate web of power. When the groom carried the chamber pot to be emptied, or oversaw the washing of linens, or polished the wooden stool, he was performing rituals that symbolized order, discipline, and respect. Each repeated gesture was both functional and political, a reminder that service was inseparable from influence. It was in this delicate interplay of duty and observation that the groom's unique authority lay. The monotony of these tasks belied their importance. For the groom, days were measured in cycles of preparation and maintenance. Yet these cycles shaped the king's comfort and perception. The chamber pot was emptied, the linen scrubbed, the herbs scattered. The water prepared all, creating a consistent environment that allowed Henry to focus on matters of state without distraction. In effect, the groom controlled the stage upon which the monarch's daily life was performed, an invisible hand ensuring that the king's routines flowed smoothly. The chamber itself, though small and private, was thus a space where the dynamics of power were played out silently. The groom's vigilance, his attention to detail, and his capacity for discretion were all forms of influence that were subtle yet profound. Other courtiers may have boasted of titles, lands, or military victories, but the groom held the king's confidence in ways that were intimate, immediate, and, at times, more potent than any public honor. In this rhythm of preparation, observation, and silent service, the groom became a constant, dependable presence. The repetition, the slow, monotonous cycle of polishing, cleaning, and arranging created a rhythm that was both hypnotic and stabilizing. Through it, the groom not only maintained the king's physical comfort, but also preserved the invisible architecture of trust and influence that underpinned Henry VIII's court. Even as the tasks seemed endless, emptying chamber pots, washing linens, arranging herbs, polishing wood, the groom's presence carried subtle weight. He reminded all who observed that power did not always reside in public ceremony. Sometimes it existed in the quiet, repetitive duties that kept the king comfortable, content, and ultimately confident in the world beyond the chamber. In this way, the groom's work, though seemingly monotonous, became a vital component of the Tudor monarchy itself. Beyond the chamber pot, beyond linens and stools, one of the more labor-intensive tasks involved preparing the king's baths. Though modern readers may imagine bathing as a simple act, in Tudor England it was anything but ordinary. A royal bath was a ceremony in itself, involving heat, water, herbs, and attendants working in careful synchrony to ensure both comfort and hygiene for Henry VIII. The process began long before the king approached the bath. Wooden tubs had to be inspected for cleanliness, polished to remove stains or residues from previous use. Water, heated over fires, had to reach a precise temperature, not too hot, not too cool. In some cases, scented oils or crushed herbs were added to the water, creating a fragrant mixture intended to soothe the skin and mask the odors of daily life in a palace where sanitation was far from modern standards. The groom of the stool supervised each step, ensuring every detail met the king's exacting standards. Attendants carried buckets of water, pouring them slowly into the tub, testing temperature with a careful hand. Too much haste could create splashes or bubbles that displeased the king. Too little attention might leave the water unevenly heated. Once the tub was prepared, towels were folded and laid nearby, and fresh linen robes were positioned for when the king emerged. Even the floor around the bath was brushed and sprinkled with herbs to prevent dampness from creating an unpleasant smell. Henry's approach to bathing itself was deliberate, and the groom's work continued throughout. He ensured that the king's hands, face, and feet could be washed with precision, providing water, towels, and support as needed. This was more than mere service. It was a delicate dance requiring attentiveness, timing, and discretion. The groom had to anticipate Henry's movements, respond instantly to requests, and remain almost invisible in his presence, all while maintaining an awareness of the broader ritual. After the bath, the groom oversaw drying and dressing. Soft towels were applied, robes were tied with precision, and the king's hair and garments were arranged. Any disruption could ruin the sense of ceremony, any slip could draw criticism. It was here, too, that the groom witnessed the king at his most relaxed and human, a rare opportunity to observe the monarch's unguarded habits and moods. These observations, though private, could be subtly influential, informing the groom's advice or positioning him favorably in the court hierarchy. The entire process, from preparation to completion, was repetitive yet demanding. Days merged into weeks, weeks into months, each bath a near-identical ritual, performed with painstaking care. For the groom, it was a hypnotic cycle: cleaning tubs, heating water, arranging linens, attending to the king, then repeating the process again. Monotony defined the rhythm, but it also created a quiet mastery over the environment, a control that extended beyond mere physical preparation into the subtleties of courtly influence. Even the smallest details mattered: the angle of the towels, the placement of the basin, the order in which attendants presented water or oils, all were scrutinized by a king accustomed to perfection. For those who served him, repetition was not simply habitual. It was a form of meditation, a slow, methodical reinforcement of both discipline and trust. The groom, through these repeated acts, became an invisible guardian of comfort and dignity, his work unseen yet indispensable. Perhaps most striking was the paradox of such labor. It was simultaneously menial and powerful, tedious yet intimate. No other courtier could claim such proximity to Henry's private routines. Through bathing, as with chamber pots and linens, the groom exercised a subtle dominion over the king's daily life. This intimate access, paired with flawless service, reinforced his status, creating a bridge between servitude and influence that few others could hope to cross. And so, the groom's life unfolded in cycles of water, linen, and herbs, a continuous pattern of preparation, observation, and silent service. The monotony, rather than being purely dull, became a steady rhythm that defined existence at the heart of Tudor authority. It was in these repetitive, meticulous rituals that the peculiar majesty of the king's court revealed itself, not in battle or diplomacy, but in the slow, deliberate care taken to ensure that even the most basic human needs were attended with unwavering precision. Even with meticulous care taken to clean chamber pots, polish furniture, and prepare baths, one aspect of the Groom of the Stool's work was never-ending, controlling the smells of the palace. In Tudor England, the concept of hygiene differed greatly from our modern understanding. Water and soap were limited, and waste disposal was rudimentary. For a king like Henry VIII, who expected comfort and dignity in every moment, the management of scent was as important as the cleaning of linen or the polishing of wood. The groom oversaw the scattering of herbs, the preparation of scented water, and the placement of sponges soaked in rosewater, lavender, or rosemary. These scents were not merely for pleasantness. They were considered protective, warding off disease and masking odors that might otherwise offend. The air in a Tudor palace could quickly become heavy with the combined aromas of cooking, human waste, and open fires, so careful attention to fragrance was essential. Herbs were selected with precision. Lavender, prized for its calming qualities, was often strewn across rush-strewn floors. Rosemary, believed to purify the air, was tucked into corners or woven into small sachets placed strategically around the chamber. Occasionally, more exotic spices, cloves, cinnamon, or dried orange peel were added to create layered fragrances that signaled wealth and taste. The groom's knowledge of these combinations was extensive. A misstep in scent could disturb the king's comfort or suggest inattentiveness. Perfumed water played an equally important role. Bowls or basins of scented liquids were positioned near the close stool or in bathing areas. The groom would dip cloths or sponges into these waters, wiping surfaces to refresh both furniture and floor. These subtle touches created an environment that seemed perpetually clean and aromatic, a delicate illusion maintained by careful labor. Even the king's hands and face could be dabbed with lightly scented water after using the chamber, a gesture of dignity that reinforced the courtly ideal of refinement. Attention to scent was also strategic. Odors, even in small amounts, could betray neglect, mismanagement, or a lapse in ritual. The groom understood that maintaining fragrance was as much about perception as hygiene. A palace that smelled unpleasant risked the king's displeasure. A chamber that seemed fresh and fragrant reinforced the image of order, control, and majesty. In this way, scent became a tool of influence, a medium through which the groom's diligence was visible in the king's experience without being overtly noticed. The work required constant vigilance. Spilled water, a forgotten heap of soiled linen, or even the lingering smell of smoke could disrupt the careful olfactory balance of the room. The groom moved with attention, checking corners, adjusting herbs, refilling scented bowls, and directing attendants in silent coordination. Every gesture was slow, deliberate, and repeated, contributing to a rhythm of service that bordered on hypnotic. Even the arrival of visitors, courtiers, or diplomats depended on this invisible labor. A guest entering the chamber might notice the polished wood, the neat linens, and the gentle fragrance, interpreting them as signs of the king's refinement and the order of his court. The groom's influence, though subtle, extended to how the monarchy was perceived externally. Through scent, he shaped an environment of dignity and control, masking the realities of human waste and the tedium of daily cleaning with carefully orchestrated rituals. This preoccupation with smell also connected to health. Tudor medical theory held that bad odors could carry disease or imbalance humors, and the groom's work was seen as contributing to the king's physical well-being. Each fragrant herb, each scented cloth was both a practical and symbolic act, blending superstition, hygiene, and ceremonial observance. In this way, the groom's role bridged the gap between the practical and the symbolic, the mundane and the political. The repetition of these tasks, scattering herbs, refilling scented water, wiping surfaces, became a defining rhythm of the groom's day. The work was slow, methodical, and largely invisible, yet it shaped every experience of the king's private spaces. Through scent, the groom maintained comfort, order, and dignity. Through repetition, he established a rhythm that connected the tactile and the aromatic to the larger currents of courtly life. Even as the groom worked tirelessly, his presence remained largely unnoticed. He was an invisible hand guiding the experience of the king, masking reality with layers of fragrance and ceremony. In these moments, the monotony of labor transformed into subtle power, a quiet mastery of environment and perception. The palace, clean, fragrant, and orderly, was as much a product of the groom's attention as it was of the king's authority. Beyond chamber pots, linens, baths, and scents, there remained one of the most personal and meticulous aspects of service, the king's toilette. While today we might think of dressing and grooming as simple routines in Tudor, England, and particularly for a monarch like Henry VIII, they were elaborate, drawn-out rituals that demanded both patience and precision from the groom of the stool and his attendants. The king's toilette began with the careful washing of hands, face, and occasionally feet. Bowls of water were brought forward, heated to the precise temperature preferred by Henry, and perfumed subtly with herbs or oils. The groom ensured that towels and cloths were folded and placed in exact positions, ready to be used at a moment's notice. Even the act of offering water required attentiveness. It could not be too slow, which might irritate the king, nor too abrupt, which might spill or disrupt the ceremony. Hair and beard care followed. Henry VIII was famously particular about his appearance. His attendants combed and oiled his hair, trimmed beards, and occasionally applied scents or powders. Each gesture was deliberate, repeated, and slow, almost ritualistic in its execution. The groom oversaw these actions, guiding younger attendants and ensuring that no detail of the king's personal presentation was neglected. A stray hair, a misaligned collar, or a smudge of powder could draw Henry's sharp criticism, and thus vigilance was constant. clothing selection and dressing added another layer of complexity. Royal garments were heavy, richly embroidered, and layered in ways that required careful handling. The groom assisted in draping robes, adjusting belts, and placing accessories. Fabrics had to be arranged perfectly, folds straightened, and jewels aligned to catch the light in the desired manner. Even the act of securing a cloak or fastening a chain demanded patience and a careful understanding of the king's preferences. While performing these duties, the groom observed the king closely. Henry might speak, ask questions, or make remarks that tested loyalty, discretion, or wit. The groom responded with measured words, providing assistance while remaining largely invisible. These intimate moments, repeated daily, allowed the groom to gain insight into the king's moods, preferences, and temperament. Unlike Casey observed from afar, he saw Henry in his most unguarded state, blending service and subtle influence. The chamber itself became an arena for precision. Mirrors were adjusted to catch light perfectly, surfaces polished to a gleam, and scented cloths placed to provide a faint aroma without overpowering the senses. Even the placement of furniture mattered. Stools, tables, and chairs had to allow attendants to perform duties efficiently while remaining unobtrusive. Every detail reinforced both the king's dignity and the groom's mastery of his environment. The repetition of the toilette created a slow, hypnotic rhythm. Each day followed a similar pattern: preparation, observation, washing, grooming, dressing, adjustment of surroundings, and final inspection. The monotony of these actions, rather than being tedious, produced a meditative quality. The groom's work became a quiet pulse, marking the passage of time and defining the daily life at the center of power. Through these rituals, the groom of the stool maintained more than hygiene. He maintained order, comfort, and the king's image. Every folded cloth, every polished surface, every carefully arranged garment was a testament to discipline and attention. The groom's influence, though invisible to most, extended into the perception of the king, the court, and even visiting dignitaries who might glimpse only the perfection he helped orchestrate. And yet, despite the gravity and intimacy of the role, the work was silent and repetitive. No grand ceremony marked the completion of a toilette. The reward was in the seamless execution, in the king's unobtrusive approval, and in the subtle reinforcement of status and influence. Each day, the groom navigated the intersection of the mundane and the majestic, where the slow art of personal care became a linchpin in the theater of Tudor power. Through these long, deliberate rituals, the groom of the stool ensured that Henry VIII emerged from his private spaces not merely clean, but perfectly presented, his authority and dignity maintained even in the smallest details. And in performing these repetitive, painstaking tasks, the groom wove himself into the invisible fabric of the court, a constant presence whose labor underpinned both comfort and control. While linens, bathing, and personal grooming occupied much of the groom of the stool's attention, another equally monotonous task awaited: the care of furniture and fixtures within the king's private chambers. Every chair, stool, table, and wooden surface demanded constant vigilance, for the king's comfort and the appearance of order were inseparable in Tudor thought. The wooden stool, central to the groom's daily duties, required polishing each day. Hard wax or oils were applied slowly, rubbed into the grain with cloths that had been carefully prepared and warmed. The motion was repetitive, circular strokes over the same surfaces, pressure carefully calibrated to avoid damage. Even slight imperfections, a scratch, a small dent, or a dull patch could attract Henry's attention and disapproval. The groom's hands, raw and seasoned from years of labor, knew the exact pressure and rhythm necessary to produce a flawless finish. Other furniture, though less central, was no less important. Tables used for washing, dressing, or holding the king's personal items were polished, dusted, and arranged with meticulous care. Mirrors and frames were cleaned with scented cloths, ensuring that the king's reflection was flawless, unbroken by smudges or dust. Candlesticks and sconces were polished to gleam in the soft glow of firelight or sunlight, casting carefully managed shadows across the chamber. Every object was positioned with intention, balancing utility and aesthetic, creating an environment of silent order. Attention extended beyond wood and metal. Fabrics covering chairs, cushions, or drapes required daily inspection. The groom smoothed wrinkles, straightened folds, and ensured that embroidered patterns remained visible and undisturbed. Any dust or debris was carefully brushed away, as even the smallest imperfection could detract from the king's perception of his surroundings. This maintenance was not purely visual. It also served practical purposes. Furniture that was polished and cared for lasted longer, and wooden surfaces treated with oils were less susceptible to rot or pest damage. Similarly, careful arrangement reduced wear on fabrics and prevented accidental stains from spilled water or oil. Each act of labor, though slow and repetitive, was both functional and ceremonial, blending utility with the theater of majesty. The rhythm of the work was hypnotic. Polishing, brushing, straightening, adjusting, then repeating the same motions over and over, day after day, week after week. For the groom, this repetition became a form of meditation, a slow pulse that marked the passage of time within the palace. It was monotonous, yes, but there was a strange satisfaction in creating perfection that was invisible to all but the king. Even small adjustments carried significance. A cushion slightly askew could disrupt the king's comfort. A candlestick misaligned could cast shadows that displeased him. The groom learned to anticipate these tiny needs, adjusting, correcting, and perfecting silently. This attention to detail reinforced his indispensability. In a court where favor was fleeting and danger was constant, being trusted with these repetitive, precise tasks provided stability, security, and influence. The monotony of caring for furniture and fixtures was amplified by the palace itself. Large chambers, with their heavy drapes, polished floors, and ornate furnishings, required hours of maintenance each day. Yet, for those accustomed to the rhythm, the work became hypnotic, almost trance-like. Hands moved automatically, eyes scanned surfaces with practiced precision, and the groom existed in a slow, steady flow of repetitive tasks. Through this labor, the groom maintained more than furniture. He maintained the illusion of order, dignity, and control. Every polished surface, every aligned chair, every clean mirror contributed to the seamless experience of the king's daily life. The monotony of the work belied its importance. The comfort of the monarch and the smooth functioning of his private chambers depended upon it. Thus, the groom's hands, though engaged in seemingly menial tasks, wielded influence quietly yet profoundly. Polishing, adjusting, arranging, and repeating, he created a rhythm that was both hypnotic and indispensable, linking repetitive labor to the very fabric of royal authority. In these endless motions, he ensured that the king's chambers remained a space of comfort, order, and subtle power where every detail, no matter how small, reflected the perfection expected at the heart of the Tudor court. Among the most laborious and continuous duties of the groom of the stool was the care of linens. While modern readers may underestimate the effort required to maintain fabric in the 16th century, for Henry VIII's court, linens were symbols of wealth, cleanliness, and status. Every sheet, towel, robe, or cloth had to be washed, inspected, pressed, and positioned with exacting care. The groom and the small team assisting him devoted hours to this task each day. Dirty linens were collected discreetly, avoiding any hint of embarrassment or discomfort for the king. They were soaked, scrubbed, and rinsed in basins of water, sometimes with scented herbs or oils added to soften fibers and add fragrance. The work required repetitive motions, rubbing, scrubbing, wringing, and laying the cloths out to dry. Fabrics were delicate, and the groom had to avoid tears or stains while ensuring that every item emerged spotless and fresh. Once dried, linens were pressed and folded with care. The folds had to be precise, corners aligned perfectly, and embroidered details displayed prominently. Even a slight misalignment could be noticed by Henry, who, accustomed to perfection, demanded consistency in every aspect of his private life. The groom developed a rhythm in folding, an almost meditative repetition that allowed him to maintain focus over hours of tedious labor. Preparation of fresh linens extended beyond folding. Sheets were laid upon beds or benches, towels arranged near the close stool, and robes positioned for immediate use. The groom paid careful attention to placement, ensuring that the king's hands, feet, and body would have seamless access to every cloth he might require. This choreography of linen contributed to the smooth functioning of the chamber, making every action of the king appear effortless and dignified. Even the scent of the linens mattered. After washing, cloths were sometimes lightly dusted with powdered herbs or scented waters to reinforce the subtle fragrance of the chamber. The groom understood that smell was an integral part of perception. Clean linens, both in appearance and scent, reinforced the impression of a perfectly maintained, orderly environment. The monotony of linen care was profound. Each day, the same cycle repeated: collecting, washing, drying, pressing, folding, and arranging. Yet in this repetition lay mastery. The groom's hands became expert at detecting the smallest flaw, a stubborn stain, a frayed edge, or a misaligned fold. His attention, sharpened by the demands of repetition, ensured that Henry's private spaces always reflected the highest standards of care and dignity. This labor also symbolized the hidden power of service. Though physically menial, the groom's role in maintaining linens gave him an intimate understanding of the king's routines and preferences. He learned the order in which Henry used cloths, the speed with which they were needed, and the subtle signals that indicated approval or disapproval. Through the repetition of this quiet, meticulous work, he gained both trust and influence, woven invisibly into the daily life of the monarch. Moreover, the groom's attentiveness ensured continuity. Should an unexpected visitor arrive, should the king rise earlier than planned, or should a sudden need arise, every cloth would be perfectly placed and ready. This foresight, built through endless repetition, demonstrated both competence and loyalty. The king's comfort, the seamless flow of his chamber routines, and the appearance of perfection all depended on the groom's relentless diligence. In these repeated actions, washing, folding, arranging, the groom of the stool became a silent architect of order. Each linen, meticulously prepared, contributed to the illusion of effortless grandeur. The monotony, rather than dulling the mind, reinforced discipline, precision, and presence of mind, turning labor into a subtle form of power. Through the endless rituals of linen care, the groom of the stool maintained not only cleanliness, but also the king's dignity, comfort, and authority. In this repetitive, almost hypnotic work, the rhythms of service became intertwined with the rhythms of court life itself, a silent but indispensable force at the heart of Henry VIII's private world. Beyond linens, furniture, and baths, the groom of the stool's attention extended to the very floors and surfaces of the king's private chambers. In Tudor palaces, floors were covered with Russia's fresh plant stalks laid down to absorb waste, dirt, and moisture. Maintaining these rushes was a never-ending task, requiring careful removal of soiled material, replacement with clean layers, and regular sweeping to preserve both cleanliness and fragrance. Each morning, the groom would inspect the floors meticulously. Rushes that had darkened or frayed were replaced, ensuring that the chamber remained both visually tidy and practically hygienic. The act of spreading rushes required careful precision, even distribution, proper layering, and attention to corners and edges where dirt and debris accumulated. The rhythm of bending, laying, and smoothing became a slow, almost meditative repetition, a foundational part of the daily ritual. Polished surfaces, from tables to window ledges, demanded equal care. Dusting with soft cloths, applying oils to prevent cracking, and arranging objects with exacting order consumed hours. Each motion was deliberate, practiced, and repetitive. A circular rub here, a gentle swipe there, all performed in a sequence that reinforced both discipline and attention to detail. Even slight deviations, a smudge left behind, a misaligned object, could irritate the king and disrupt the perceived perfection of the chamber. The groom's work extended to corners, nooks, and hidden spaces often overlooked by others. Behind furniture, beneath stools, and around drains. Every area was inspected and cleaned, ensuring no trace of dirt or odor persisted. In this way, the chamber became a controlled environment, a stage on which the king's daily routines could unfold without distraction. The monotony of this labor, though exhausting, became a rhythm that structured the groom's day and defined his mastery over the private spaces of the monarchy. Even the choice of cleaning materials carried significance. Brushes, cloths, and oils were selected for their effect on both the surfaces and the senses. Soft cloths prevented scratches, while scented oil subtly enhanced fragrance. Water was applied carefully, never too much to create damp patches that might offend the king's sensibilities or damage wooden floors. Every gesture was measured, every repetition honed to perfection over countless days of practice. The hypnotic repetition of cleaning floors and surfaces also reflected the groom's deeper understanding of order. Through these endless motions, he maintained not only hygiene but also the perception of absolute control. The palace, polished and fragrant, appeared effortless in its grandeur, concealing the constant, painstaking labor that sustained it. In this rhythm of preparation, observation, and maintenance, the groom's presence became both invisible and indispensable. Furthermore, cleaning extended to practical concerns. Spilled water, residual herbs, or stray dirt could attract pests or create odors. The groom's vigilance prevented these issues before they became visible, preserving both comfort and dignity. Through repeated cycles of sweeping, polishing, and adjusting, the chamber was maintained as a space of seamless order, where every detail, no matter how small, contributed to the king's sense of control and well-being. The monotony of floor and surface care, like that of linens, furniture, and bathing rituals, was both hypnotic and grounding. Each repeated motion, performed slowly and deliberately, created a rhythm that marked the passage of time within the palace. The groom's labor, though invisible to all but himself and the king, shaped the environment, influence, and perception of authority at the very heart of Tudor power. Through the daily, repetitive care of floors and surfaces, the groom of the Stool became more than a servant. He became a guardian of order, a silent architect of comfort, and a subtle force of influence whose tireless attention ensured that every aspect of the king's private world operated flawlessly. In this endless repetition, monotony transformed into mastery, and labor became a powerful instrument of service, trust, and silent authority. Amidst linens, baths, and floors, one of the most repetitive and hypnotic aspects of the groom of the Stool's work was the management of the king's bowls, basins, and chamber pots. These items, though mundane in appearance, were central to both hygiene and the rituals of service that defined the court's private life. Their care required constant attention, precise handling, and a rhythm of labor that was nearly endless. Each bowl and basin had to be inspected before use. Scratched or chipped vessels were replaced. Stains and residues scrubbed away with meticulous effort. Water was heated and added carefully, sometimes with scented oils or herbs to enhance fragrance or soothe the skin. The groom oversaw these preparations with unwavering vigilance, ensuring that the king's comfort and dignity were maintained in even the smallest details. Chamber pots, though unspeakably monotonous in their role, demanded particular care. They were emptied and cleaned frequently, scrubbed with solutions of ashes, sand, or scented water to remove any lingering odors. Each motion was deliberate. Tilt, rinse, scrub, polish, replace. Even the angle of handling mattered. A slip could spill contents, staining the floor or attracting disapproval. Through this repetition, the groom developed an almost meditative mastery over his tools, turning laborious tasks into a rhythm of precision and control. Beyond the physical act of cleaning, the groom coordinated the placement and availability of these items. Bowls and basins were arranged for immediate use, ensuring that the king never experienced discomfort or delay. Fresh water was replenished at the right moment, towels and cloths positioned nearby, and scented herbs applied subtly to maintain a continuous aura of cleanliness. Every gesture was rehearsed, every action anticipated, creating a seamless flow in the chamber that allowed Henry VIII to move with dignity and ease. The hypnotic repetition of these tasks shaped the groom's day. Morning, afternoon, and evening cycles repeated almost identically, preparing basins, emptying pots, replenishing water, scrubbing surfaces, and attending to the king's immediate needs. For the groom, this monotony became a form of meditation, a slow rhythm that structured both his labor and his attention. His hands moved automatically, eyes scanning for imperfections, while his mind remained alert to subtle cues from the king. The groom's influence extended through these small actions. Though invisible to most courtiers, his diligence ensured the king's comfort. maintained hygiene, and upheld the illusion of effortless order in private spaces. Visitors, if they ever glimpsed the pristine basins or fragrant bowls, would perceive only the majesty and control of the king, never realizing the tireless, repetitive labor that sustained it. Even small errors carried risk. A bowl misplaced, a chamber pot insufficiently cleaned, or water left cold could irritate the king, undermine comfort, or even reflect poorly on the groom's diligence. The stakes were subtle yet profound through repeated care. The groom not only maintained hygiene but also reinforced trust, loyalty, and his silent influence over the king's environment. The monotony of caring for these vessels, like that of bathing, linens, and floors, was hypnotic. The rhythm of repetitive motions, scrubbing, rinsing, polishing, arranging, became almost trance-like. The groom's labor, invisible to most, sustained the very experience of comfort and dignity that defined Henry VIII's private life. It was in these slow, methodical cycles that service merged with subtle authority and monotony became mastery. Through endless vigilance over bowls, basins, and chamber pots, the groom of the stool shaped not only the king's physical environment, but also the perception of control, hygiene, and order. In repetition, monotony, and meticulous attention, he created a world where comfort and ritual were inseparable, and where the slow, hypnotic labor of a servant became the invisible foundation of royal authority. One of the most subtle yet essential duties of the groom of the stool involved herbs. In Tudor England, herbs were used not only for fragrance but also for perceived medicinal and protective qualities. Lavender, rosemary, thyme, and rose petals were scattered across floors, tucked into linens or infused into water for bathing. The preparation and placement of these herbs became a slow, repetitive ritual, central to the daily life of the king's private chambers. The groom's day began with the inspection of herb supplies. Freshness was paramount. Wilted leaves or dried petals could compromise fragrance and even offend the king. Each herb had its purpose: lavender to calm, rosemary to purify, thyme to mask odors, and rose to delight the senses. Preparing them required repetitive tasks: sorting, crushing, mixing, and arranging in precise quantities. Even small deviations could affect the desired aroma, making attention to detail critical. Placement of the herbs followed a deliberate pattern. Rush-strewn floors were sprinkled to create a continuous fragrance as the king walked. Small sachets were tucked into corners, behind furniture, or into drawers, ensuring that every area maintained a subtle, pleasant scent. Herbs were also applied to bathing water or sprinkled into fresh linens, reinforcing the atmosphere of order and comfort. The groom had to time these actions carefully, ensuring that the scent remained consistent and never overpowering. The labor involved was hypnotic in its repetition. Sorting, crushing, and scattering herbs demanded precise, rhythmic motions. Each step had to be performed methodically to maintain quality and consistency. The groom's hands became attuned to the textures of leaves and petals, his senses calibrated to detect the slightest change in fragrance. Over time, this repetitive work became a form of meditation, reinforcing patience and focus while maintaining the king's comfort. Herb preparation also carried subtle symbolic weight. In Tudor belief, fragrance was connected to health, virtue, and order. By ensuring that the chambers were imbued with pleasant, carefully curated scents, the groom participated in maintaining not only the king's physical well-being, but also the aura of majesty and discipline that defined the court. The repetition of this labor was both practical and ceremonial, blending mundane work with symbolic significance. Even minor errors were consequential. Misjudging the quantity, selecting the wrong herb, or scattering it unevenly could disrupt the intended effect, drawing the king's notice or disapproval. Through constant repetition and vigilance, the groom honed the precision necessary to achieve perfection, reinforcing his indispensability and influence. Each small action contributed to an environment of seamless control, where even scent was meticulously managed to reflect order and dignity. The monotony of herb preparation, like other aspects of the groom's duties, became hypnotic. Day after day, the rhythm of crushing, sorting, and scattering merged into a slow, meditative cadence. This repetition, though seemingly dull, shaped both the physical environment and the psychological comfort of the king. It demonstrated the power of invisible labor. Through repeated, precise acts, the groom maintained the illusion of effortless perfection. Ultimately, herb preparation was a testament to the groom's skill, patience, and influence. By managing fragrance, he contributed to the king's comfort, reinforced order within the chambers, and exercised subtle control over the private environment. In the hypnotic repetition of these tasks, monotony became mastery, and service transformed into a form of silent authority at the heart of Henry VIII's daily life. Beyond herbs, linens, furniture, and chamber pots, the groom of the stool maintained a relentless vigilance over water, its supply, quality, and temperature. In Tudor England, the control of water was a task of precision and repetition, essential for bathing, washing, and general hygiene. For Henry VIII, water was more than a tool. It was a medium of comfort, ritual, and royal authority. The groom's role required constant attention, slow, deliberate work, and perfect timing. Water for bathing had to be heated carefully over fires, ensuring it reached the king's preferred warmth. Too hot, and the bath could be uncomfortable or dangerous. Too cold, and the king's approval might be withheld. The groom monitored the heat, tested it repeatedly, and adjusted carefully, pouring water incrementally into tubs or basins. Every pour was measured. Every bucket lifted and transported demanded strength and precision, repeated countless times in cycles throughout the day. Even water for washing hands, face, or feet required the same attention. Bowls were filled, reheated, and replaced, maintaining a constant supply of clean, warm water. The groom timed each action so that the king never experienced a lapse in comfort. Towels were positioned in cloths dipped into water at precisely the right moments. This repetitive rhythm, fetching, pouring, testing, adjusting, became a hypnotic pattern, defining the flow of the groom's day and ensuring the king's private routines unfolded flawlessly. Water quality, too, demanded constant oversight. In Tudor times, water could carry impurities or odors that might offend the king. The groom filtered or clarified water when needed, sometimes using herbs or boiling to maintain a sense of purity. Every action from collection to placement was repeated with precision, forming a cycle of labor that was physically demanding and monotonous, yet vital for the perception of comfort and hygiene. The groom's repeated attention to water extended to the chamber's broader environment. Spills had to be immediately addressed, floors wiped, bowls adjusted, and basins refilled. Even the reflection of light on water surfaces mattered, creating a subtle visual harmony in the chamber that complemented the king's routines. These details, though imperceptible to most, were noticed by Henry, reinforcing the groom's indispensable presence. This repetitive labor was hypnotic, almost trance-like. The groom moved in slow, deliberate cycles, lifting, pouring, testing, adjusting, and repeating. Hours could pass with hands constantly wet, bodies bent over tubs, eyes focused on the perfect balance of heat and volume. Yet through this monotony emerged mastery, control over the king's environment, influence over his comfort, and the silent exercise of authority through precision and reliability. The cyclical nature of water management mirrored other aspects of the groom's duties. Bathing, linens, chamber pots, floors, and herbs all demanded repetition, forming an endless rhythm that shaped the daily life of the court. In each cycle of motion, the groom maintained order, comfort, and the illusion of effortless perfection, transforming repetitive labor into subtle power. Through constant oversight of water and temperature, the groom of the stool became both caretaker and silent architect. His labor ensured that the king's private world remained predictable, dignified, and under perfect control. In this slow, repetitive work, monotony became mastery and daily service, merged seamlessly with the rituals of authority and influence that defined life at the heart of Henry VIII's palace. After countless days spent in the endless cycles of bathing, cleaning, polishing, herb scattering, linen care, and water management, the groom of the stool stood as the silent, invisible master of the king's private world. Every repetitive task, every monotonous motion, every small, unnoticed gesture contributed to an environment that appeared effortless, serene, and perfectly controlled to the king and his courtiers. The final part of the day, like every other, followed the rhythm established over years of disciplined labor. Fresh linens were laid out, bathwater drained and cleaned, bowls and basins scrubbed and refilled for the next morning. Floors were swept and rushes replaced. Surfaces polished to gleaming perfection, and fragrant herbs positioned to scent the air subtly. The groom moved slowly, deliberately, his motions perfected through repetition so that nothing was missed, nothing left to chance. In these moments, the groom's role as an unseen architect of order became clear. Though he remained largely invisible, the king's comfort, dignity, and well-being depended entirely on his labor. Each monotonous motion reinforced a pattern of mastery that few could perceive but all could feel. The palace, spotless and fragrant, seemed to function effortlessly, but it was the groom's tireless, repetitive work that created the illusion. The hypnotic quality of these repetitive tasks had its own rhythm, almost like a meditation. Each day mirrored the last in detail, yet the groom's attention never wavered. A slight misstep could disrupt the order, offend the king, or reveal a lapse in diligence. Precision and vigilance were constant companions, turning what might seem to outsiders as monotonous drudgery into an essential instrument of control, comfort, and subtle authority. Even the king himself might have taken for granted the seamless execution of these rituals, unaware of the labor that underpinned each perfectly arranged bath, each polished piece of furniture, each fragrant sheet and pillow. Yet the groom's influence extended far beyond mere hygiene. He shaped the king's experience, reinforced the court's perception of order, and exercised a silent, almost invisible power through unwavering repetition and tireless attention. The groom's work also reflected the broader rhythms of Tudor life. Monotony was not merely tolerated, it was mastered. Repetition became a form of skill, a discipline that allowed him to anticipate needs, correct errors before they were seen, and maintain control over a complex and demanding environment. Every small task, no matter how dull, was a thread woven into the fabric of the king's daily life, sustaining both comfort and authority. As the day drew to a close, the groom could observe the quiet results of his labor. The chamber glowed with polished surfaces, scented herbs, perfectly arranged linens, and clean basins. The floors reflected careful attention, and even the faintest odors of human presence were masked by subtle fragrances. In this silent, repetitive mastery, he had transformed the mundane into art, the monotonous into ritual, and service into invisible power. And yet, for all its hypnotic repetition, the work was never complete. Tomorrow, the cycle would begin again, bathing, cleaning, arranging, polishing, and attending to every detail that Henry VIII's comfort and dignity demanded. The groom of the stool, bound to this endless rhythm, existed as the quiet heartbeat of the king's private world, invisible to all but essential to everything. In monotony, repetition, and meticulous attention, he held mastery not just over rooms, linens, and bowls, but over the seamless illusion of royal perfection itself. Through these daily rituals, repeated endlessly with care and precision, the groom of the stool ensured that the king's life remained comfortable, dignified, and uninterrupted. In the hypnotic monotony of his labor lay the quiet power of service, a mastery of environment and perception that few would ever notice but that shaped every aspect of life at the heart of Tudor England.